In the last 10 years, we've supported over 300,000 women with free advice and support when they experience discrimination or bullying or harassment at work.
That's a phenomenal number, 300,000, because those are women who've experienced those things and discovered pregnant and screwed and picked up the phone to the advice line. So the size of the problem must be so much bigger than those 300,000 that you've reached.
We know from the Equality and Human Rights Commission that 54,000 women a year are pushed out of their jobs for daring to procreate. So that's 1 in 9 pregnant women. It's a woman every 10 minutes in the UK.
Meet over half of the working world. They are the machine that powers our society, from pouring your coffee and emptying your bins, through to caring for a relative or delivering your parcels. You may see them as essential or frontline workers, or you might not see them at all. The Invisible Worker podcast explores the financial landscape of Britain's most diligent workforce. We speak to experts in policy, inclusion, and research to understand their challenges and start to figure out how we can solve them.
My name is Emily and I host the Invisible Worker podcast, brought to you by Stream, the world's leading financial wellbeing provider. On today's episode, we are talking about the motherhood penalty, which is the career and financial setback that women face when they become mothers. It's not just because they become mothers, though. When men become fathers, they get a career and financial boost. Doesn't seem very fair. And we're talking about that on the Invisible Worker podcast because the Invisible Worker, well, she is a mother. We're joined today by Joeli Brearley. Joeli, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Joeli is the founder of the Pregnant and Screwed charity, author of the book by the same name, and renowned campaigner. It's so great to have you here, and I would love for you to tell us a little bit more about your story from setting up Pregnant and Screwed through to taking the government to court in 2021.
Oh, okay. I set up Pregnant and Screwed because when I was 4 months pregnant with my first child, I informed my employer that I was expecting. And the next day they sacked me by voicemail.
Unreal.
And my employer was a children's charity.
Wow.
And it was a woman, I should say, who pushed me out of my job. So I went through the process of trying to access justice. I had a very clear case. I could have taken them to tribunal. But at the same time, I discovered that I was having a high-risk pregnancy. I went for a routine hospital appointment. They discovered my cervix had almost vanished. They said if the baby comes anytime soon, then he will die.
Wow.
Because I was just 4 months pregnant. They rushed me into surgery. They did this delightful process of trying to bolt my cervix together.
Women's health is good times, right?
Beautiful stuff. And they pleaded with me to reduce stress in my life, to protect the health of my baby. And as you only have 3 months less 1 day to raise a tribunal claim from the point the discrimination occurs, it literally left me with a choice between accessing the justice I really clearly deserved. And obviously a tribunal is one of the most stressful things that you can do. I was being told to reduce stress. So I dropped the case. Obviously I had to. It felt like I had no other choice. I couldn't live with myself if the baby died. And then I found myself pregnant, unemployed. I had no income. I felt like I'd lost my career. I was lying on a sofa watching daytime telly, rubbing my belly, begging my unborn child to stay put for just another day, just another week. And I felt like I'd lost everything. Overnight, I was suddenly reliant on my partner to pay my rent, to put food on the table. And all that I was good for was as a vessel for this growing fetus. And I wasn't even doing that very well. I was failing at that. And those 3 weeks, they radicalized me. They just completely changed the way that I viewed the world and a woman's position within it.
Yeah.
The baby survived. He's now 11 years old.
Wonderful.
And after he was born, I started talking to other mothers about their experiences at work and discovered that far from mine being an isolated incident, pretty much every woman I spoke to had some negative experience at work.
Yeah.
And I just thought, why are we not talking about this? Why was it a shock when it happened to me? And so initially Pregnant Then Screwed was a blog. It was a place for women to tell their stories anonymously. And it mushroomed and grew from there. So then we started to build a following. I realised that we needed a campaign to extend the tribunal time limit from 3 months to at least 6 months.
Yeah.
And then we realised that there were all these issues that were affecting working mothers, childcare. And so we started campaigning on every element of that. And then we also set up an advice line to give women free legal advice when they experience discrimination. And in the last 10 years, we've supported over 300,000 women with free advice and support when they experience discrimination or bullying or harassment at work.
That's a phenomenal number, 300,000, because those are women who've experienced those things and discovered pregnant and screwed and picked up the phone to the advice line. So the size of the problem must be so much bigger than those 300,000 that you've reached.
Well, we know from the Equality and Human Rights Commission that 54,000 women a year are pushed out of their jobs for daring to procreate. So that's 1 in 9 pregnant women. It's a woman every 10 minutes in the UK.
Wow.
And we know that 77%, so 3/4 of mothers experience some form of discrimination in the workplace.
About 80% of women in the UK will become mothers by the time they're in their 40s. There's research that shows most women expect to become mothers, as most men expect to become fathers. 78% of mothers are in work, but the women's rate of employment is more like 71%. So you are more likely to be in work if you are a mother with dependent children than if you are a woman without children. And so it's high. It's a lot of people.
Yeah.
It's not a niche group that we're talking about.
Yeah.
It's really significant.
We know that about 1 in 2 employees have some form of caring responsibility. So whether that's an elderly relative or whether it's a dependent child. So it is a significant part of your workforce that are affected by you having structures and systems that don't work for people with caring responsibilities.
And there's a few dots I want to join for employers as well. So when we think about a frontline or essential workforce, which is people who have to go to work, so we're looking at things like the social care sector, hospitality, retail, cleaning, distribution, those sorts of jobs. More women do that kind of work than men. Women do most of the low-paid work. More women work part-time. So about 4 in 10 women work part-time. It's more like 1.5 men in 10. I don't know if we can do a half man, but you can see how much higher it is. And so these sectors of work that maybe find it harder to think about flexible working, for example, when you have to be in a retail shop to do your job, have the people who need that the most. Our women and mothers are coming into these job functions because they are trying to piece together a career around their other caring responsibilities.
And in lower paid roles, there is option often to work part-time, but of course that means that you're reducing your income even further, and there isn't options for other types of flexible working that would benefit you as a mother with caring responsibilities. Employers want you to be flexible. They want you to be able to come in to do shifts at the drop of a hat. They want you to stay late if they need you. But actually, when the workers need flexibility for their responsibilities, that flexibility isn't available.
I want to come back to that conversation and I want to talk a bit more about unpaid labour. But first, I was so interested when I was reading your book to learn a little bit more about the history of women in the workplace. We've got about just over 70%, 71% of women in work. That's down on the 15th century. That used to be around 80%. I'd love to kind of do a whistle-stop tour of the kind of the movers and drivers of how work has changed for women and for mothers.
Up until the end of the 15th century, the majority of women worked, and they worked in the home because most of the work was done on the land. When they had children, particularly wealthier women, they would send those children off to a wet nurse, and they'd stay with the wet nurse for the first 2 years of their life. Sadly,
gosh, can you imagine?
Can you imagine? I don't think any of us would want it that way, but I think it really...
Maybe for a week.
Yeah. Would love a week, particularly in the first 2 years.
Yeah.
And so children were mainly seen as a way of increasing the labour force.
And a bit of social security, because you need your children to look after you down the line.
Yeah. And then we had the first industrial revolution.
1706, I think my notes tell me.
Yeah. And the industrial revolution meant that people were working outside of the home, and we needed people to be working in the factories and the mills and the mines. So that was often jobs given to women and children. Yeah. Children as young as 4 were working in the factories.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you had two philosophers, Jean-Jacques Rousseau and John Locke,
Mm-hmm.
who started the nature-nurture debate. Suddenly, the role of mothers very much changed. They were very influential philosophers. And they essentially said to mothers, your reputation is dependent on your children and the behaviour of your children. And then we had the suffragettes, of course, who started to fight back a little bit against patriarchy. And then they were rudely interrupted by the First World War.
Yeah.
Where men, of course, went off to fight. And that meant that they needed women to work. So my nana made bombs during the war. About 80% of women were then working as well, while the men went off to fight. And because we needed women in work, suddenly work could be flexible. And suddenly 1,345 nurseries were developed so that women could get the childcare they need.
That's an astonishing number of nurseries.
We went from 14 nurseries.
Sorry, 14, 1-4.
Yeah.
To
1,345 nurseries in 2 years. Because when we needed to make the workplace work for women, we could. Up until 1960, when you got married, you were expected to obey your husband.
Oh, yeah.
You had no legal right to own property unless you had inherited the property. You were completely financially dependent on your husband. And then things really started to change between 1960 and 1980. So you could access the pill.
Yeah.
You could have an abortion. You could get a divorce. Hurrah. You could own property yourself. There were a lot of women in work. There was this newfound freedom for women. And then in the 1990s, there was essentially a bit of a pushback against this, particularly from the Conservative Party.
Yeah.
We had given women too much freedom. They could now be single parents. They didn't depend on a husband anymore.
I know there's sort of some more recent history we haven't touched on yet. I want to pause for a moment, though, and talk about the marriage bar. I found this very offensive, actually, to learn about the marriage bar. This idea that in certain jobs, when you got married, your employer would ask you to leave, and that was totally fine. And it dates back to 1894. So the civil service introduced the marriage bar for their clerical staff, their female typewriters. And in 1921, they formally codified this in the civil service. That was actually 2 years after some legislation, the Sex Disqualification Act, said you can't discriminate on the basis of sex. So 2 years after that had happened, the civil service was like, well, I think we're going to anyway. And so it just continued. It was prolific. And the BBC introduced it in 1932. This feels like very modern times. And the BBC is saying, if you're married, you don't get a job anymore. In 1935, it began to get unpicked. So kind of the London County Council removed its marriage bar for teachers and medical staff. The BBC waited until 1944. They took a bit longer before they got rid of it. In 1946, the civil service stopped doing that kind of in home territories, but it wasn't until 1973 that they stopped doing it in the foreign service abroad. It's astonishing, the idea that you could create this piece of legislation that says, we can sack you if you get married.
I remember my grandmother first telling me about it and being absolutely horrified that had existed in such recent times. It was heavily implemented just after the First World War as a way, again, of shifting women out of the jobs because they were really men's jobs. And when you talk about these legislative frameworks that existed and you were appalled and horrified by them, you couple that next to 54,000 women a year being pushed out of their job for getting pregnant. And you think, oh, okay, well, it sort of makes sense that we stigmatize women as being distracted and less committed to their job from the point that they get pregnant, because it is so inherent in us to believe that, and was literally written into law for decades. That we should not be working, we should be at home making house.
I want to close off our conversation on the history of women in the workforce. We've looked at where they began, where they got to, but there's a bundle of relatively recent legislation that I think is really important. Starting with 1970, the Equal Pay Act. Thanks to the Dagenham machinists who went on strike for equal pay for equal work.
Done them.
Yeah, well done them. Thank you very much. And then shortly following in 1973, maternity rights were introduced into the UK. And then in 1975, the Sex Discrimination Act came in, which officially ended the marriage bar, and that you cannot discriminate on the basis of sex or marital status. 1992, we got a nice European directive that gives you the right to 14 weeks maternity leave and pay and the right to return to your previous job.
Yeah.
These rights were extended in 2006 with the Work and Families Act. And then in 2010, this is the big one, the Equalities Act listed pregnancy and maternity as a protected characteristic.
Thank you, Harriet Harman, for that one. Yeah, it's quite shocking, I think, to some people to realise that it was less than 2 decades ago, less than 20 years ago, that we got the maternity rights that we have now.
Yeah.
Now we can access 52 weeks of maternity leave.
Yeah. And in 2015, shared parental leave was introduced. The Employment Relations Flexible Working Act, which was enacted on the 6th of April 2024, which gives employees a right to request flexible working from day one in their jobs. Going back to 2010 with the Equalities Act, which sets pregnancy and maternity as a protected characteristic, that sets the scene for women to be able to take their employers to court.
Yeah.
Because one of the things I learned is that if you want to take your employer to tribunal, in general, it's not very favorable for you. So most claims that you can make against an employer are limited to loss of income. But if it's a protected characteristic, the sky's the limit.
You have injury to feelings on top of that. So that's really where you can start to increase the amount of money that you get from an employer. But it is really important to say that fewer than 1% of women who experience discrimination even raise a tribunal claim. That's not even getting to tribunal because it's so difficult to do. It's costly. You have this 3-month time limit. It's really complicated. And you're really vulnerable. You've just had a baby. I could barely get dressed every day when I had a baby. Or you're pregnant, in which case we know that stress can be really damaging for a mother and a baby. So very few women actually go down. They just give up.
Yeah.
They just think, do you know what? I can't do this. I'm too tired. I have no money. I feel beaten up by the whole process. I just want to crawl under a duvet. And they, of course, then will have postnatal depression or mental health issues as a result. Those that do take legal action, they're so brave. The courage it takes to do that, the courage, the tenacity. And many do it without legal advice because they can't afford to have legal advice. So they're trying to teach them self-employment law, often with a tiny baby. So they're trying to breastfeed and it's exhausting and debilitating. Those that get to tribunal, as I say, very few get to tribunal. They go through this very brutal process where they are told they're lying, where they often are forced to grill the people who have treated them so appallingly.
Gosh, I can't imagine doing that.
And at the end of it, hopefully they win.
Yeah.
For most women, they do it not because they want the money. They do it because they want an apology.
Yeah.
They want a judge to sit there and say, you have been treated appallingly. And we can see that. And we want you to know that this was wrong.
Yeah. That's what I wanted. I was working for a company when I got pregnant. My boss was really delighted for me. He knew that my husband and I had been struggling with fertility issues. It'd taken us a long time to get there. He was so supportive. Couldn't have asked for a better reaction. And I had planned to come back after 6 months off. And for me, I remember really clearly when I was off on mat leave, the company I was working for appointed a new chairperson of the board. And I came back in and we had this really big bid going on. It was worth millions. And I was part of the team of 3 that was going to go in and be in the room and pitch for this bid. And as I went to walk into the meeting room, they were like, oh, just a minute. I need to speak to the boys. And I was like, okay, fine. And I waited outside and I waited a bit longer. And it got to about 10 minutes. I thought, this is awkward. And I went and sat back down at my desk and did some work. 2 hours passed. The meeting was done. I'd been locked out of the entire meeting. And they came out and said to me, oh, sorry about that. I just had some stuff I had to sort out with the boys. But there's still a really important thing you can do. Because this bid that we're now putting in, we need to get it really nicely printed and bound.
Oh my God. And I mean, that the boys, makes me shudder.
Yeah.
That's a shocker.
Yeah, it was death by 1,000 paper cuts for me.
Yeah.
I raised a grievance and I left and I went through the ACAS process. And in my case, there was no malice behind it. Nobody deliberately set out to do anything awful to me, but there was a lot of thoughtlessness. And that thoughtlessness was illegal. I reached this point where I was like, I have to do something. I have to make them acknowledge that what they did was not okay. And I didn't get as far as tribunal, because when you go through the ACAS process, the first step is you have to go through what they call early conciliation, where a mediator attempts to reach out to the other party and you and say, what do you want? What are you going to do? Is that fine? And if you can reach an agreement through early conciliation, they're very happy. They don't want you to go to tribunal. If they make an offer to you and you then take them to tribunal and the award that the judge gives you is less than what they offered you, you can be on the hook for their legal fees. So it's actually quite scary. You feel quite compelled to take that offer and say, thanks very much, we're done now. And really for me, that's what I wanted. I wanted them to know that it was wrong, to make an offer and to close the door on that and move on.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so important to get that acknowledgement.
Yeah.
Because without it, you just feel like you've been through this really hellish experience and nobody sees you. You feel completely invisible. I heard from one woman who was forced to do a shot of vodka every morning to prove she wasn't pregnant.
Jesus.
We did some research that found that such a high proportion of women are told to get an abortion if they want to keep their job. It was 1 in every 68 women who gets pregnant. They go and tell their employer, and their employer suggests they have an abortion if they want to keep their job.
Wow.
I've heard stories about a woman who had hyperemesis, the type of morning sickness that makes you so violently unwell you can end up in hospital on a drip. She was going to the bathroom 6 or 7 times a day to vomit, and her boss clearly thought she was skiving, so he made her vomit in a waste paper bin next to his desk in an open plan office of 60 people.
That's awful, because you often weed yourself when you vomit when you're pregnant.
Yeah, on both ends in an open plan office is not pleasant. He clearly did it to humiliate her.
Yeah.
There's such a mix of stories out there, but it's not that hard to get this right. A woman goes on maternity leave. When she comes back, give her job back. And when she comes back, she's going to need a process for reintegration, that she will have caring responsibilities, and therefore she may need some carers leave, because when your child goes to nursery, we know that they all lick each other and come back with these crazy 18th century diseases.
The things you've never heard of. Exactly.
Cough and all of the things you thought had died out a long time ago. The
Hand, foot and mouth.
hand, foot.
Yeah.
That was a lovely one.
We've been talking a lot about women in work. We've been talking about the history of women in work, maternity discrimination, some really cheery topics. And I want to again pull us back to why we're talking about this on the Invisible Worker podcast, which is the outcome of the way women and their role in work and their role as mothers has changed over time, and the outcome of societal attitudes and the way women are treated when they come back to work has created this situation where women do more part-time and low-paid work. Women are the invisible worker. There are certainly men in there, but we know that women do about 60% of the low-paid work, and they do much more part-time work. And that is a driver of the gender wage gap. So let's talk gender wage gap and the motherhood penalty.
So we see in terms of earnings that men and women are earning about the same amount. If they're working in the same sector and they have the same qualifications, their pay trajectory is about the same. So it goes up and up and up.
Yeah.
And then from the point that a woman gets pregnant, it starts to go down and it drops off a cliff.
I've seen the O&F charts, and it actually goes down. The line changes directions.
Yes.
Yeah.
And for the first 5 years, it tends to stay relatively low, and then it slowly starts to pick itself back up again. But of course, by this point, you're so far behind that we know that by the time a woman's first child is 12 years old, her hourly pay rate is 33% behind a man's on average. That's data from the Institute of Fiscal Studies.
Yeah.
The reason why this happens, it's very complex. and multifaceted. But a woman gets pregnant, she takes maternity leave. And because of our antiquated parental leave system in the UK, which means women can take up to 12 months, men get 2 weeks, if that, it means that women are taking these long periods of time out of work, whereas the majority of men go back to work very fast.
And you said in your book, and the data backs this up, that men are viewed more favorably when they've had a baby because they're seen as more committed to being the breadwinner. So they earn more.
Exactly that. When we've talked about the history of women in work, you can see where that comes from, right?
Because women had to leave because of the marriage bar.
And we did perceive men as being the breadwinner. And the mum is at home doing all of the unpaid labour.
Yeah.
When actually the reality is very different. In the majority of households, you need 2 incomes to survive and thrive.
Yeah.
Because of our antiquated parental leave system and women taking these long periods of time out of work, the woman learns how to look after the baby.
Yeah.
They know how to get them to nap. They know how they want their toast sliced up. None of this comes with a manual.
And they've learned how to do this while nobody's watching and judging them. There's nobody over their shoulder going, you're doing it wrong. That's not how you do it.
So the father or the second parent tends to fall into the supporting role. They'll make you a cup of tea. They will be there to put some pasta on while you're putting the child to bed. But it means that when a woman returns to work, she is the one that makes the career sacrifices because she is now firmly in this role of main caregiver. So she decides, do I put my child in childcare? If so, it's really expensive.
It's really expensive.
For lots of women, it doesn't make financial sense to go back to work because they compare their salary to the cost of childcare and they think this isn't adding up rather than comparing it to household income. Also, it's really hard to get childcare, so they may not be able to get it. So they're already starting to think, I need to either go part-time or I need to give up my job.
Or find a job closer to home that I can dip in and out of. Yeah.
Because commuting is, again, a massive issue. If your child gets sick, it can't take you 2 hours to get back to collect them from nursery.
And in my day job working for Stream, we support frontline workers and 65% of our membership base are women. And the data that we see about the jobs they're doing and the pay they're earning across our membership base, 60% are part-time workers. So 60% of people who are in frontline work in this ecosystem that we look at in it doing part-time work. And they might be stitching together multiple part-time jobs. We see a lot of that, but they're still part-time.
Yeah. I mean, I think some women do go into jobs that are paid by the hour because it means that they can then hopefully be a bit more choosy about the times that they're working, and you want to be able to pick your child up from school and be able to drop them off. So this obviously doesn't just affect you when your children are in nursery, it carries on until they're old enough to be independent.
And again, that's reflected in our data where we see roughly 70% of people are being paid by the hour. And if we look at the age profile of who's in those buckets, the age profile of women tends to follow the kind of the O&S distribution curve, whereas for men, it's much more geared towards younger men. So men are escaping this work profile of kind of part-time and hourly paid work, and women are persisting through their careers in it.
Yeah, women's career opportunities deteriorate significantly. So they're then essentially on what is affectionately called, and I hate this term, but it's called the mummy track, where they're
I hate the word mummy.
I hate the word mummy too, but people know it as the mummy track, and it's where they're stuck in part-time work. They are not progressing, and it takes years before they feel that they can escape that trap that they're in. It entrenches poverty because there aren't escape routes for women because childcare is so expensive. So you obviously need somebody to be looking after your child to be able to work. But if you haven't got family close by who are available to look after your child, you have to rely on a dysfunctional, very overpriced childcare system.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in a minute. But I think the poverty point, I don't want to let that escape us. There are over 4 million children living in poverty in the UK. I think it's 4.3. 7 in 10 live in a household with at least one working parent.
Yeah.
And 44% of single parent households are in poverty. And 9 out of 10 of those are run by women.
It is an impossible situation.
And it's so many compounding factors that drive this gender wage gap. And in fact, it's primarily a motherhood wage gap. The big drivers of this difference is having children for women. even being perceived as less committed. So there was blind CV reviews, or if you mentioned someone was a mother on the same CV, companies would offer a lower starting rate of pay. There's the fact that you end up doing more part-time work to manage these caring responsibilities. So you're not only earning less because you're not working as many hours, but part-time work tends to be at a lower rate of pay than full-time work.
Yeah.
There's the fact you're doing so much more unpaid labor. This one made me angry. The data suggests that on average, women do 26 hours a week of unpaid labor. Men do 16 hours a week of unpaid labor. When you look at what counts as unpaid labor, a big chunk of those 16 hours for men was driving themselves to work and back. I thought that was bollocks, frankly.
Whereas for women, that unpaid labour is the cooking, the
Yeah.
cleaning, the caring, doing the dirty work, essentially, that keeps society spinning and ensures that often men are enabled to have these very successful careers.
Yeah, now I hate driving, so I'm not jealous of those driving hours, but it seems a bit rubbish to me. And women between 25 and 45 do way more than 26 hours on average. They're more like 35, 40 hours of unpaid labour. It's a full-time job.
Yeah, on top of a full-time job for some women. And it's worth
Absolutely.
saying as well that those statistics don't change when women are earning more money than
Yeah.
their male partner. In fact, often they're doing even more unpaid labour, and it's almost as if they're trying to compensate and not make the man feel emasculated by the fact that they earn more money.
Yeah, and this then impacts your later life, right? Your pension. And so the pension wealth gap, there's different ways of slicing it. And there's one method which looks at how much pension wealth do you have when you're 55. And if you use that methodology, there's a 35% gap. So women have about 65% of the pension that men have. I think the difference is 94,000 versus 145,000 by the time you're 55. But if you actually look at what happened in 2024 of men and women at retirement age, it was wildly different. Women had about a third of the pension wealth that men had in 2024 at retirement age. And so that was a difference of £136,000, which would take the typical working woman 19 extra years of work to catch up on that pension gap. And the worst part about all this for me was understanding that how unfair it gets, for example, down the line if you end up separating from your partner. So you've made this household decision about how you're going to divide labour, whether you've been explicit about that or not. One person is working and earning more. Maybe you're not putting as much into your pension. In 70% of divorce cases, pensions are not divided. There's no mandate to divide pensions. There's a growing body of women who are actually taking legal action against their family solicitors saying, you've misadvised me and the amount of wealth that I should be getting is much, much less. And for women, when they get divorced, their pension wealth halves. For men, it drops by a third. Not cool.
And this isn't about buying nicer bread or going on fewer holidays. Those figures are catastrophic.
Yeah, it's so important. And then the last piece to connect that back to the part-time work is that if you earn less than £10,000 at the time of recording, your employer does not have to automatically enroll you into their pension scheme. And that is twice as likely to impact women as men. Yeah. Also because it's on a per job basis. It's not looking at your total income. So you might have 2 part-time jobs that you're stitching together to manage your schedule. If they're each below £10,000, you're not automatically enrolled. You don't get the benefit of your employer's pension contributions. And so women are really missing out on that wealth building for lots of different reasons. Yeah, okay, I want to talk about something a little bit controversial because I know that when you talk about the motherhood pay gap, you get a lot of pushback from people saying you chose to have kids, so it's on you, right?
Yeah.
It's clearly not just one person who chose to have kids. In many circumstances, there'll be 2 people as part of that equation. Yeah. But I think it's worth reflecting on what is the social value of children? Why must we propagate the species?
We've got a baby crisis in the UK. We are not having enough children. And that is a really big issue for our future economy and our future society because, of course, as we get older and we retire, we rely on younger people coming through to be working, to be paying their taxes, to keep the economy going. We speak to mothers all the time who have one child and are desperate to have another. And the majority of them say they will not have another child because it doesn't make financial sense for them to do so. We did some devastating research about the number of women that have had abortions and say childcare costs were the main reason they aborted their child.
Wow.
And then housing costs, of course, on top of that.
Let's talk a bit more about childcare and the infrastructure that would enable women to thrive financially. And there's a couple of big building blocks here I want to talk about. One is childcare and one is shared parental leave. Which one do you want to do first?
Let's go childcare.
Okay.
Women have been fighting for affordable, flexible, high-quality childcare for decades. This isn't a new thing.
Well, we had it in the war and then they took it away.
Exactly, yeah. And since there were big campaigns in the 1970s, there was also the Wages for Housework campaign, of course, that was trying to show all this unpaid labour that women were doing.
Yeah, it's worth about half of GDP.
Exactly, yeah. And affordable, high-quality childcare is a means of freedom for women.
Yes.
We just don't have that in the UK.
No.
To the contrary, we have one of the most expensive childcare systems in the world. Even if you can afford it, it's really difficult to get it. Many nurseries now have a waiting list that's over a year long.
Yeah.
So in some cases, I hear from women who have to put their child's name down the moment they find out they're pregnant. So they're 7 weeks pregnant, they have to put their child's name down at a nursery. They have to pay a deposit.
Yeah.
What happens if they lose the baby, which in 1 in 4 pregnancies before the...
Oh, you're not telling me they're not getting the deposit back.
No, they don't. They don't get the
gosh.
deposit back. We're seeing nurseries close left, right. It doesn't make financial sense to be a childminder in the current economy. So we're hemorrhaging childminders.
There's two sides to this, though, because it's very expensive and unaffordable. And also, as a society, we don't value care work or childcare work very highly.
Yeah.
So we are unwilling to pay a high wage to people who deliver care, and that's predominantly women.
And if you look at other countries, they pay childcare professionals very highly, and those jobs are high status.
And children are so irrational. It's such a grind dealing with them day in and day out.
Imagine looking after 5 2-year-olds. I can't look after one.
Yeah. No, thank you. Again, we've spoken about you have to propagate the species. Even the social contract around pensions, your state pension is paid for out of current national insurance contributions.
Yeah.
It's this, they call it the pay-as-you-go system.
Yeah.
And so if that breaks down, if we don't have the structure in place to enable people to have children and bring the next generation through, wealth breaks down for everybody and economic growth breaks down for everybody. So it can't be the burden on just the people who are having children to pay for that. It has to be spread. It's fundamental infrastructure. It's like roads or military or healthcare.
The 2023 budget, this commitment to an additional 5.2 billion investment in childcare, which we were all elated about. And that means that by September, eligible parents will be able to access up to 30 hours of funded childcare per week, term time only.
Yeah.
But the cost of childcare outside of those funded hours is expected to increase so much that it will swallow up a lot of those savings.
Yeah.
So we're not really going to see the fruits of this because of the pressures on nurseries. They're having to continually increase their costs.
And therefore, the birth rate remains stubbornly low. So it's about 1.53 in the UK. It needs to be 2.1 to replace the species and to grow. There's nowhere in kind of the OECD where it is 2.1. But if you look at a country like Sweden, which is notorious for their investment in affordable childcare and kind of infrastructure around families, it's higher, right? It's 1.67 compared to our 1.53. And that will still take some time to flow through. So there is hope. You can see the direction of travel, but we have to make those investments in infrastructure to enable society to function in future.
Sweden is what we like to call the nirvana.
Yeah.
And they have a great parental leave system, which encourages men to take long periods of time out of work as well as women. They call them latte papas in Sweden. So you see all these men drinking their cappuccinos with their babies in papooses or in their prams everywhere. They have this really affordable, really high quality childcare system where childcare professionals are paid really well for the job that they do.
Yeah. So that kind of moves us on to talk about shared parental leave, which is one of the things that Sweden eventually got, because when they launched it, it wasn't mandatory and their take up was, I think, around less than 2%. No men took it.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until they changed it and they created these chunks of use it or lose it, paid, and it's paid at 80% and it's paid by the government,
Yeah.
that they completely changed the take up of shared parental leave. And here we are in the UK. We've had it available since 2015, but again, the take up is persistently low. But I'm an outlier because my husband took shared parental leave with me.
done.
And do you know what? I was getting statutory maternity pay. He worked for a big corporate that gave him 6 months fully paid shared parental leave. No brainer. Obviously, I went back to work after 6 months and he picked up the second half of that year. And that has been fundamental in us having equality in our domestic relationship because he knows how to pack a nappy bag. He had the privilege of getting to learn to parent without somebody watching him and telling him he was doing it wrong. He understands the ins and outs of the kids' lives. He sees it as his job to look after them and not just mine. Even today, when I was prepping to come here and meet you, I said, I'm a bit busy. I've got some stuff to do. I don't need to tell him what to put in their school bags. I don't need to tell him where the clothes are. He's a fully competent, functioning parent and he participates fully. And some of that is his character, but I give an awful lot of credit to shared parental leave because I do not see that behavior mirrored amongst people where the leave was split differently, where the woman took all or the majority of the leave.
And the data supports exactly what you've said. So if you look at Sweden, where dads are taking much longer periods of time out of work, the unpaid labour gap is much smaller.
Yeah.
And that continues through the child's life. They are doing much more of the cooking, the cleaning, the caring. The women aren't project managing.
No.
Absolutely. The problem with our shared parental leave system is that it's not shared parental leave at all. It's shared maternity leave.
Yeah.
It requires a woman to give away a portion of her leave to a man in order for it to work. And of course, many women don't want to do that.
Yeah.
They think, I'm knackered, I've just given birth, and I want to take this time to spend it with my baby. And in addition to it being shared maternity leave, in the majority of heterosexual couples, the man earns the most. So when you're working out the finances as a family, it doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense for you to do that. It makes much more sense for the woman to continue doing it. We did some research with the Centre for Progressive Policy, looking at countries that have at least 6 weeks paternity leave paid at 90% of salary. And we found that in those countries, there is a 4% smaller gender pay gap. So this would decrease our gender pay gap because more women would be working. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation has just done some research again with the Centre for Progressive Policy, and they found that increasing paternity leave at 6 weeks at 90% of salary would contribute £2.6 billion to the economy. So this makes financial sense to the economy.
Yeah.
But also we know that if dads spend a decent amount of time with the children in those early days on their own, couples are more likely to stay together. There was one university study that found that they're 40% more likely to stay together. So it reduces the divorce rate.
I buy that because, again, you're not having to be the project manager in your household. You have a competent partner who is sharing in all the load.
Yeah. Kids do better in the education system. Mothers are mentally and physically healthier, so that they're less likely to develop postnatal depression and they're less likely to develop birth complications. So there are huge benefits, societal benefits, as well as economic benefits, and yet we have the worst paternity benefit in Europe.
Good for us. Work to be done. Okay, let's talk about something where maybe the winds of change are a bit more positive. Let's talk about flexibility and flexible working. So we touched on this earlier in our conversation, but I want to come back to it and I'm thinking about the financial lives of the essential worker, how we can make flexibility work.
Flexible working can mean home working, remote working in some form. It can mean hybrid working. It can mean part-time working. It can mean concentrated hours. It can mean job shares.
Yeah.
There is a real plethora of different types of flexible working that are available. And there are very few jobs where at least one of those types of flexible working isn't available. Flexible working is so important to mothers in particular because they have these responsibilities. You can't leave little Johnny on the doorstep of a nursery with a packet of beef flavoured hula hoops and hope he'll be okay.
Yeah.
Somebody has to be available to pick him up.
Yeah.
What employers really need to do is give a bit more autonomy as well to their workforce, to have that flexibility to be able to say to their colleague, could you just pick up these 3 hours here and I'll do this for you? That often can make a really big difference. But also concentrated hours can make a big difference to parents. So rather than working 8 hours a day, 5 days a week and being very rigid, that's when you have to work. Perhaps allowing them to work 10 hours a day, 4 days a week, so they have an extra day, so they're able to do all of the other unpaid labour that they're responsible for.
Yeah. I think we're pretty much out of time, Joeli. If there's one thing you want to stick in people's head, what is the one thing you want people to know about this typical working mother, or to be thinking about what they can do for Britain's working mothers?
Can I have 3 things?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I want employers to know that mothers are some of the most productive people you can employ. And there's lots of evidence to support that. The Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis did a research project and they found that over a 30-year career, mothers outperform other types of employees at every stage of the game.
Yeah.
There was some research done by Clark University that found that women with 2 children are the most productive people that you can hire. You want something done, give it to a busy person. In terms of the government, what I want them to know is that we are way behind other countries on this, and the economy is missing out. The mental health of the population is missing out. Children are missing out.
Yeah.
And we need an affordable, high quality childcare system, and we need that quickly. Number 3 is what people can do in the home. For the allies listening, I'll repeat a quote from Helen Lewis, who said, "There is one great contribution men can make to feminism. Pick up a mop." We need to see more men doing more of the unpaid labour if we have any hope of really changing things.
Not just driving themselves to work and counting that.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Joeli Brearley.
Thank you.
Before you go, make sure you stay in touch. Please subscribe to the Invisible Worker podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you go to listen. That way you can follow along as we release new episodes. Thanks again, and see you soon.